Last time, we followed him into Peru, where he spent years perfecting a method that cost almost nothing and worked almost every time. A small kindness offered to a child from a poor or indigenous family in a place where her disappearance would barely be searched for. We told you he claimed more than 100 victims there, a number we cannot verify because Peru never charged him with a single one of them. We told you how it nearly ended. A community that caught him themselves, buried him alive in the sand up to his neck, and was talked out of finishing the job by an American missionary who handed him to police instead, who let him go. He crossed the border again, into Colombia, into Ecuador, carrying the same appetite, the same method, and, for a while longer, the same freedom that 3 countries' worth of shrugging institutions kept handing back to him. This time, the ground itself was about to stop cooperating with him. A market square in Ambato, Ecuador, early 1980. Crowded, loud, the way every market in every Andean city is crowded and loud on a good trading day. Vendors calling out prices, coins changing hands, children weaving between stalls at knee height, while their mothers haggle over the price of potatoes and cut flowers. Diesel exhaust and frying bread compete for the same narrow street. It is, in every ordinary way, an unremarkable morning. A tall man with a scar on his cheek and a gap where his upper front teeth should be is walking a young girl by the hand, away from the noise, toward the edge of the crowd. He has done this before, dozens of times, across 3 countries, over the better part of a decade. He knows exactly how it goes. He knows how to look unhurried. He knows how to make it look, to anyone glancing over, like nothing at all. Her mother sees him do it. We are going to leave the 2 of them there for a moment, the man, the girl, the mother just beginning to understand what she is looking at. Because to tell you what happens next, we first have to tell you everything that led up to this exact square, on this exact morning, after years in which almost nothing ever led up to anything at all. After Peru, López did not stop, and he did not slow down. He moved into Colombia and then into Ecuador, and the pattern that had gone unnoticed for years across the Peruvian highlands simply continued, unbroken, across a new set of borders, as though the border itself had never meant anything to him beyond a place where one country's suspicion ended and another country's ignorance began. Young girls disappeared from towns along his route. Authorities in each place he passed through did, eventually, notice an uptick in missing children. The numbers were not subtle, if anyone had cared to compare notes across a provincial line. And, as had happened before, and would keep happening right up until the very last possible moment, they concluded that the most likely explanation was trafficking, or runaways, or family disputes gone wrong. Anything, it seems, other than the specific and much rarer possibility that a single man was moving from town to town, killing as he went, and that the disappearances everyone kept filing separately were in fact one long, continuous crime. It is worth pausing on why that comparison never happened, because it is not a mystery, and it is not even really a failure of intelligence. Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in this period had no shared system for tracking a missing persons case across a border, and in most cases barely had one for tracking a case across a provincial line within the same country. A police captain in one small Ecuadorian town had no reason to know what a police captain 200 kilometers away, in a different jurisdiction, was quietly failing to solve. A single predator, moving deliberately and often, was in some sense the perfect exploit for exactly this kind of fractured, disconnected system, not because he understood bureaucracy, but because he understood, correctly, that nobody was going to be comparing his description against a growing file of complaints from 3 different countries. Nobody was keeping that file at all. 2 of his victims from this stretch of the story, in Colombia, have names. We are going to say them now, clearly, because this series does not reduce the people he killed to a body count, however tempting a clean, round number always is to reach for, instead of the harder work of remembering someone specific. Hortensia Garces Lozada was a girl who earned coins selling newspapers on the streets of Ambato, old enough to work a street corner on her own, young enough that a stranger offering 100 sucres to follow him somewhere still looked, to her, like good luck rather than danger. On the 5th of May, 1979, that is exactly what happened. He gave her the coin. He led her to a bridge on the edge of town. He raped and killed her there, under that bridge, and then he went on with his day. Flor Alba Sanchez was a girl from El Espinal, Lopez's own hometown, the same small town he had once run away from as a boy, the same streets where he had briefly, all those years ago, been just another child, rather than a predator returning to hunt in familiar territory. On the 14th of December, 1979, he raped and murdered her there as well. She was found 20 days later, buried on municipal land, alongside a second girl, Blanca Bautista, both of their bodies showing signs of torture. Sanchez would end up being the only Colombian killing he was ever actually put on trial for. One single name, out of everyone he later claimed, and everyone investigators came to suspect, that a courtroom anywhere ever formally addressed. 2 more girls were murdered in El Espinal in the weeks that followed, on the 21st of December and the 3rd of January. We are not going to give you more detail about them than that, because the record does not give us more, and this series does not invent what isn't there simply to fill a silence. By the time he settled into a pattern of returning to Ambato specifically, Lopez had made a habit of frequenting Plaza Urbina, presenting himself as a fellow street vendor, one more man scraping by in the market economy, unremarkable, blending in with everyone else trying to make a living off a folding table and a paper bag of goods. He was, in one very literal sense, hiding in plain sight. And in another sense, he wasn't hiding at all. He was tall. He had a prominent nose, a large scar running down his right cheek, and a visible gap where his upper front teeth should have been. The kind of face that, once seen clearly, tends to stay with a person. This was not a man who blended into a crowd photograph. This was a man whose description, had anyone been collecting descriptions, would have been easy to write down and easy to recognize a second time. He would stand near the newspaper vendors at the plaza, listening as they read the day's headlines aloud to whoever cared to stop and listen. Headlines that, as this period wore on, increasingly concerned the growing number of missing girls across the region. By some accounts, he wore what witnesses later described as a crooked grin, while he listened to strangers read aloud about the disappearances he himself was causing. We want to flag that particular detail specifically as something reported after the fact, by people who already knew exactly what he was by the time they were asked to remember him, telling a story backward from an ending they now understood. Memory does that, especially after a monster has a name. It is worth being honest about that distortion here, out loud, rather than presenting the detail as though it had been captured on film in the actual moment. 2 young women working that same market deserve to be named as well, because they are a direct part of the reason any of what follows happened at all. Luz Marina Lozada sold flowers. Marina Cuenca sold beverages, moving through the crowd with a tray, calling out to thirsty shoppers on a hot morning. Both were approached by Lopez with his usual offer, a coin, in exchange for walking somewhere with him, ostensibly to help a stranger find his way. Both declined, and unlike so many girls before them, in so many towns before this one, both of them talked about it afterward, to other merchants working the same square, saying plainly that they suspected the man might be a trafficker. that something in the way he asked had felt wrong. It went nowhere officially. No police report that we know of was ever filed. No formal investigation was opened on the strength of two vendors' unease. But it planted something. A name, however informal, for the wrongness other people had perhaps also half noticed over the preceding months and never quite said aloud to anyone. Sometimes that is exactly how the first crack in years of silence actually starts. Not with a police report, not with a detective's hunch, but with two young women telling their neighbors that something felt wrong about a particular man and being right. And then the rain came, and did, in a single night, what none of that quiet, accumulating suspicion had yet managed to do on its own after years of trying. In April of 1980, flash flooding hit the areas surrounding Ambato, the kind of sudden, violent Andean rainfall that reshapes riverbanks and hillsides in the space of a few hours, tearing at ground that has sat undisturbed for months or years at a time. When the water finally receded, it had done something no detective in 3 countries had managed across more than a decade of this man moving between them. It pulled bodies up out of the ground. Most accounts count 4 young girls among the remains the flood exposed, though at least one source is vaguer, saying simply that there were several. We are giving you the more specific figure because it is the one more consistently repeated across the sources we reviewed, while flagging plainly that the exact count is not settled beyond all doubt. For the first time in this entire story, this was no longer a rumor passed quietly between market vendors, and no longer a headline about one more runaway girl who would probably turn up somewhere, eventually, the way officials had always assumed before. This was bodies, plural, buried, hidden deliberately, undeniably murdered. The first hard, physical, unarguable evidence that something far worse than trafficking had been happening in this valley, for who knows exactly how long before anyone noticed. Grief, in a town like Ambato, travels fast and travels whole. Within days, there was likely not a household in the area that hadn't heard some version of what the flood had uncovered. And there was likely not a mother in that town who hadn't, at least once, looked a little longer than usual at a stranger walking too close to her own child. The town was still absorbing that discovery, still trying to work out what it meant, and, more urgently, who was responsible for it. When, just days later, locals reported seeing a familiar tall man with a scarred cheek leading a young girl away from a crowd, in exactly the unhurried, practiced way he always did it. Here is that market square again, the one we opened this episode with. The tall man, the girl, the mother beginning to understand. Her name was Carlina Ramon, and what she did in the next few seconds is the entire hinge of this story, the single moment on which everything that follows depends. She did not freeze. She did not assume, as so many bystanders in so many towns before her had assumed, without even quite deciding to assume it, that this was simply a father, an uncle, a family friend walking a child somewhere. She had just watched floodwater pull 4 small bodies out of the ground on the edge of her own town, days earlier. She knew, in a way that a mother in a quieter week might not have known, exactly what she might be looking at. She screamed, and this time, for the first time in this entire story, across 2 countries and more than a decade of near misses, the people around her did not look away and did not assume someone else would handle it. A crowd formed almost instantly. Word of the bodies in the riverbank had already spread through the town in the days since the flood. Suspicion had already been quietly seeded by 2 market vendors who had said, out loud, to anyone who would listen, that something felt wrong about this particular man. And now here he was, in the middle of a public square, in broad daylight, doing the exact thing everyone had just spent days beginning to fear. The crowd did not wait for police to arrive. They converged on him themselves, the way an Ayacuchoan community in Peru once had, years earlier, and a country away. And they held him there until it was decided what would happen next. We want to be precise about one detail that varies across the record, because we promised you at the start of this series that we would flag exactly this kind of discrepancy rather than smooth it over. Sources disagree on the exact age of the girl he was leading away in that final moment. Some say 9 years old, some say 10, some say 12. We do not know which is correct, and we are not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a cleaner sentence. What we do know, with complete certainty, is that because of what her mother did in that square, that particular girl went home that day. She is, so far as we can tell from everything that survives in the record, the only one of his intended victims across this entire story whose name we simply don't have, because she is also, as far as the record shows, one of the very few who lived to have one withheld rather than reported. This time, the authorities did not get the chance to quietly shrug him away across a border, the way Colombia had, the way Peru had. This time, an entire crowd of ordinary people, a mother, a florist, a beverage vendor, and everyone in that square who had spent the previous days absorbing the news of 4 small bodies pulled out of a flooded riverbank, closed around him before he had the chance to disappear, the way he had disappeared, cleanly, out of every single town before this one. Say the thesis of this episode to yourself plainly, because it is the same one underneath everything we have told you across 3 countries now. Just finally arriving, for once, at a different outcome than it had before. Pedro López was never actually hiding from the world. He was hiding from institutions. The world itself, his neighbors, the market vendors around him, the mothers standing in a crowd on any given morning, had been noticing him in pieces for years. In exactly the way ordinary people usually do notice a wrongness they can't quite name yet. It took a flood, of all things, to finally hand them the one piece no institution in 3 countries had ever managed to hand them on its own. Physical, undeniable proof of exactly what all those small, half-noticed pieces had been adding up to the entire time. It is tempting, telling a story like this one, to make the ending feel inevitable, as though the flood, the vendor's suspicion, and Carlina Ramon's scream were always going to arrive together, sooner or later, and finally close the net around him. We want to resist that temptation because it flatters everyone involved, including the systems that failed for so long before this particular morning. The truth is closer to something more uncomfortable. A specific, unrepeatable coincidence of weather and timing happened to occur in the one town, in the one week, when 2 market vendors had already planted a seed of suspicion, and a mother happened to be close enough and paying enough attention to scream instead of freeze. Change any one of those small facts, and there is no reason at all to believe this story ends any differently than it had for the 10 years before it, with him crossing one more border into one more country that had no idea yet what was coming. He was taken into custody that day in Ambato in 1980, held by the very people whose children he had spent the better part of a decade taking from them. What he chose to say to police once he was finally inside a cell, and, far more tellingly, exactly when and why he chose to stop talking, is where this story goes next. That is where we are going to pick up next time.